Sometimes, Rebecca told the audience, it takes a personal story to create meaningful change. Each of us has the opportunity to build ramps instead of barriers in our communities, both literal and figurative. In the front row, Walter Prescott shifted uncomfortably in his seat, the only person wearing a bow tie in the summer heat. Beside him, the other former board members nodded with enthusiasm that seemed only slightly forced. After the speeches and the ceremonial cutting of the ribbon, residents toured Claire's garden, now redesigned to showcase accessible landscaping features. Rebecca found herself in conversation with a group of architects specializing in universal design, while Claire chatted with neighbors who suddenly seemed very interested in her professional expertise. As the event wound down, the sisters found a quiet moment together on the porch, watching the sunset from the top of the beautiful new ramp. "You know," Rebecca said, in an odd way, "we should thank Walter Prescott." Claire raised an eyebrow. "For being a discriminatory bureaucrat. For creating an opportunity," Rebecca clarified. "Sometimes people need to see injustice clearly before they're motivated to fix it. All those accessibility bills I've been pushing for years. Suddenly, everyone wants their name on them." Claire clinked her glass against her sister's. "To unintended consequences. And to stubbornness," Rebecca added with a smile. "Yours and mine." As twilight settled over Oakwood Estates, the last visitors departed. The neighborhood looked the same as it had 2 months ago. Manicured lawns, elegant homes, pristine sidewalks. But something fundamental had shifted. From Mrs. Chen's house came the sound of construction as workers installed handrails on her front steps. 2 doors down, the Petersons were discussing a wider doorway to accommodate their teenage son's sports injury. Small changes, Claire thought, but significant ones. Sometimes a single ramp could change an entire community's direction. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a message from her office. "The accessibility funding bill passed committee," she announced. "Unanimous vote." Claire smiled. "Not bad for a month's work, Governor." "Not bad for 2 stubborn sisters," Rebecca corrected, wheeling herself smoothly down the ramp to admire it from below. "Though I'm starting to think I'll miss this place when my recovery's complete." Claire followed her sister down the ramp, appreciating its gentle slope and solid construction. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I hear Oakwood Estates just updated their regulations about home offices. The governor could probably work from here anytime she wanted." Rebecca laughed. "I'll consider it. After all, the neighborhood has become so much more accommodating lately." As night fell completely, the ramp's subtle lighting activated automatically, illuminating the path from sidewalk to door, not just for Rebecca, but for anyone who might need it in the future. Within 6 months, the conflict had transformed from a family dispute into a regional crisis. The royal court of Meropolis became a battleground of influence as both the Valyrians and Solarans leveraged their considerable wealth to sway nobles to their cause. King Dominic, attempting to remain neutral, found himself increasingly isolated as his advisors took sides. The first major military engagement occurred not in Meropolis itself, but at the vital port city of Eastwatch. Solaran ships had established a blockade, preventing Valyrian spice shipments from reaching their northern markets. When diplomacy failed to resolve the standoff, Marcus Valerian convinced the king's naval commander to escort their merchant fleet through the blockade. "We simply seek to protect legitimate trade," the commander declared as 30 warships sailed alongside the merchant vessels. "No sovereign nation can allow its commerce to be restricted." Alina Solaran, having anticipated this move, had already secured support from the neighboring kingdom of Lyra, whose fast attack vessels waited hidden in the coastal inlets. The ensuing battle lasted 3 days, claimed over 2,000 lives, and ended with the harbor of Eastwatch in flames. News of the battle spread with unprecedented speed. Each side claimed the other had fired first. Artists created dramatic paintings of the conflict, further inflaming public opinion. Street performers reenacted stylized versions of the marketplace, insult that had started everything, each rendition becoming more exaggerated than the last. King Dominic, finally recognizing the severity of the situation, called for a peace summit. Representatives from 12 kingdoms arrived at the royal palace, each with their own agenda. The summit might have succeeded if not for another fateful incident, an assassination attempt against both Marcus and Alina on the summit's third day. Though both survived, each blamed the other's family. The summit collapsed. King Dominic, whose palace security had failed to prevent the attack, lost the last of his credibility. Within weeks, his own council forced his abdication in favor of his more decisive younger brother. The new king immediately declared support for the Valyrians, citing their long-standing contributions to the kingdom's prosperity. This decision prompted the Soldaran allies to formalize their own coalition. Military historians would later identify this moment as the transition from family conflict to full-scale war. What followed was a period of rapid militarization. Kingdoms that had maintained only defensive forces for generations suddenly expanded their armies. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging weapons. Rural populations watched as their sons were conscripted into fighting forces. The mountain kingdom of Helios, known for its master metallurgists, became strategically crucial to both sides. When its king refused to choose an alliance, his kingdom was partitioned by force. The northern mines controlled by Soldaran allies, the southern by Valyrian supporters. The mountain passes became bloody battlegrounds as civilians caught between tried desperately to flee. Foreign powers began to intervene more directly. The Desert Empress sent her elite cavalry to support the Valyrians. The Island Confederation, initially neutral, eventually sided with the Soldarans after a disputed naval incident. Most troubling was the emergence of new military technologies developed specifically for the conflict. Engineers on both sides created increasingly destructive siege weapons. Alchemists refined explosive compounds that could breach previously impenetrable fortress walls. The ancient art of fire projection, long abandoned for its horrific effects, was rediscovered and deployed. The conflict had evolved far beyond its origins, taking on a momentum that no single person or kingdom could now control. 3 years into the war, the landscape of the known world had been fundamentally altered. Once prosperous cities lay in ruins. Trade routes that had flourished for centuries stood abandoned. Fields that had provided abundant harvests now served as mass graves for fallen soldiers. The human cost was beyond comprehension. Villages emptied as young men marched away to war, many never to return. Famine spread through regions where farmers had abandoned their plows for swords. Refugee camps swelled with displaced civilians seeking safety from the fighting. Perhaps most remarkable was how the original insult had been transformed in public consciousness. Both sides now claimed to be fighting for existential reasons, the preservation of their way of life, the defense of sacred values, the protection of future generations. Few civilians could accurately recall the specific words exchanged in that marketplace, yet millions were willing to die for what those words had come to represent. In the fourth winter of the war, an unexpected development changed its course. Marcus Valerian, whose health had been declining for months, collapsed during a strategy meeting. Physicians diagnosed a rare wasting disease with no known cure. As he lay dying, he requested a private audience with his longtime enemy. Against the advice of her generals, Alina Soldaran agreed to meet him under a flag of truce at a small temple in disputed territory. What transpired during their conversation remained known only to them, but witnesses reported that both emerged visibly shaken. Marcus died 3 days later. At his funeral ceremony, Alina appeared unannounced and alone. An act of either tremendous courage or foolishness. Standing before the assembled Valyrian family, she spoke words that would be recorded in every historical account of the conflict. "We have become so consumed by winning that we have forgotten what we are fighting for. I look across our lands and see nothing worth claiming victory over. The time has come to end this madness." Her gesture might have ended the war then and there if not for the power vacuum created by Marcus's death. His younger brother, Sebastian, had always been more hawkish in his approach to the conflict. Taking control of the Valyrian interests, he rejected Alina's peace overture and intensified military campaigns. This escalation prompted new factions to emerge within both coalitions. Moderates who had long favored negotiation became more vocal. Extremists who prospered from the continued fighting worked to undermine peace efforts. The conflict became as much internal as external, with assassination and counter-assassination destabilizing command structures on both sides. The turning point came unexpectedly from beyond the known territories. Foreign merchants from across the Great Eastern Sea arrived with disturbing news. A massive empire had been expanding along distant shores, systematically conquering every nation in its path. Their advance fleet had already been spotted approaching the war-weakened kingdoms. Faced with this existential threat, Elena Solaran made a bold proposal. Using secret channels, she contacted Sebastian Valerian with detailed intelligence about the coming invasion and a plan for mutual defense. Initially skeptical, Sebastian agreed to a temporary ceasefire after his own scouts confirmed the reports. The Great War that had consumed a generation was about to transform yet again. Old enemies would need to become allies. The question remained whether societies so deeply divided could unite against a common threat, and whether anything would remain worth saving after 5 years of devastating conflict. What had begun with a simple insult now faced its most consequential chapter. The ceasefire announcement sent shockwaves throughout the warring kingdoms. Soldiers who had spent years trying to kill each other now stood in uneasy proximity along newly established demarcation lines. Military commanders who had dedicated their careers to defeating the enemy found themselves sitting across negotiation tables, planning joint defenses. Elena Solaran and Sebastian Valerian met at the neutral ground of the ancient temple, the same place where Elena had spoken with Marcus in his final days. Their initial meeting lasted 16 hours as they reviewed intelligence reports and debated strategy. Despite years of enmity, both recognized the existential threat posed by the approaching empire, known in distant lands as the Golden Dominion. They conquered not just land but culture, explained Jin Cora, a merchant who had escaped the Dominion's advance. They erase all that came before: language, customs, history, replacing it with their own. Those who resist are not merely killed but erased from memory. The response required unprecedented cooperation. Sebastian proposed unifying their naval forces to create a blockade against the invasion fleet. Elena suggested using their coalition's superior knowledge of local terrain to prepare land-based defenses. Together, they drafted what would become known as the Concordat of Necessity, a framework for military alliance without resolving the underlying conflicts. Not everyone embraced this fragile peace. Hardliners on both sides viewed cooperation with the enemy as treason. General Maddox of the Northern Armies attempted a coup against Elena, which was thwarted only by the intervention of former Valerian soldiers who had witnessed the scale of the approaching threat. Similarly, Sebastian faced assassination attempts from within his own family, orchestrated by cousins who stood to profit from continued conflict. The most significant challenge came from the general population. 5 years of propaganda had conditioned citizens to hate the opposing side with religious fervor. Riots erupted in major cities when the ceasefire was announced. Religious leaders who had proclaimed divine sanction for the war now struggled to explain the sudden alliance. "We have asked you to hate for so long," Elena admitted in a public address. "Now we ask you to set aside that hate not out of forgiveness, but survival. Judge us harshly if we survive to face your judgment." The preparations transformed society yet again. Blacksmiths who had forged weapons of war now created tools to strengthen coastal defenses. Farmers returned to abandoned fields, knowing their harvests would feed a unified resistance. Engineers from both coalitions collaborated on defensive innovations that neither could have developed alone. As the massive invasion fleet appeared on the horizon, 52 previously warring vessels sailed out in formation to meet them. The battle that followed would later be called the Engagement of Twin Horizons, named for the smoke that blackened the sky in both directions. Though outnumbered, the Allied forces used their intimate knowledge of local waters to devastating effect, employing fire ships and hidden reef passages to divide the enemy fleet. On land, the Golden Dominion forces that made it ashore encountered united resistance, where they had expected to find warring factions. Every hill, valley, and forest had been prepared with defensive positions designed by commanders who had previously used the same tactics against each other. For the first time in 5 years, the people of the 12 kingdoms fought with a common purpose. Villages that had lost sons fighting each other now lost more defending each other. The irony was not lost on those who survived to record these events. As the first month of resistance ended, the outcome remained uncertain. The Golden Dominion had never failed in a conquest before. But then again, they had never encountered enemies who had spent years perfecting the art of war against worthy opponents. The Golden Dominion had conquered 17 lands before reaching the 12 kingdoms, and their confidence bordered on arrogance. Their commander, the Arch-Sovereign Deimos, had never tasted defeat. Upon witnessing the unexpected unified resistance, he dispatched emissaries with a simple message: surrender now and maintain limited autonomy, or resist and face complete annihilation. The emissaries arrived at the Joint Council Chamber, where representatives from all 12 kingdoms had gathered. Sebastian Valerian and Elena Solarin sat side by side at the head of the council table, a sight unimaginable just months before. Your internal wars have weakened you beyond recovery, the lead emissary declared. The Dominion offers mercy where none is deserved. Kneel now or be erased from history. Elena stood first, her expression calm despite the gravity of the moment. We have spent 5 years discovering exactly what we are willing to die for, she replied. It seems we will now demonstrate this to you as well. The emissaries were escorted back to their vessels with the unanimous refusal. What followed was the Dominion's standard response to defiance, a 3-day bombardment of coastal settlements designed to break civilian morale. Cities that had already endured years of warfare now faced a new level of destruction. Yet instead of breaking the alliance, the bombardment strengthened it. Soldiers who had fought on opposite sides now pulled survivors from rubble together. Field hospitals treated wounded without asking which coalition they had supported. The shared suffering crystallized a truth that 5 years of diplomacy had failed to establish. Their commonalities far outweighed their differences. The war entered its most desperate phase. The Dominion pressed its numerical advantage while the Allied kingdoms employed increasingly creative defensive strategies. Mountain passes became death traps for invading forces. Village militias perfected the art of nighttime raids. Naval squadrons sacrificed themselves to prevent enemy landings. 3 months into the invasion, a pivotal moment arrived. Dominion forces had established a beachhead and were advancing toward the critical junction city of Westcroft. If it fell, the Allied defenses would be split in two. Every available soldier was dispatched to hold the line. Sebastian Valerian personally led the Valerian House Guards, elite soldiers who had remained out of the conflict until this moment. Elena Solarin commanded the combined archer corps, positioned on the surrounding hillsides. Together, they prepared for what would likely be their final stand. The battle began at dawn and raged through the day. By mid-afternoon, the situation appeared hopeless. Dominion forces had breached the outer defenses and were advancing toward the city center. Sebastian was wounded, his forces in retreat. Elena's archers had expended most of their arrows against the seemingly endless waves of attackers. What happened next would be recounted for generations. As Dominion forces prepared their final push, drums sounded from the eastern ridge. An army appeared on the horizon. Not Dominion reinforcements, but thousands of warriors bearing the banners of the desert kingdoms. The Empress herself led the charge, fulfilling an ancient pact of mutual defense that predated the Commerce War. The tide of battle shifted dramatically. Caught between 3 forces, the Dominion troops found their superior numbers becoming a liability in the narrow confines of the valley. By nightfall, they had been driven back to their beachhead. This victory did not end the war, but it marked the beginning of the end for Dominion ambitions. For the first time in their imperial history, they had failed to advance. More importantly, the kingdoms had discovered something profound. United, they were more than capable of defending themselves. As Sebastian and Elena stood on the battlements that evening, watching Dominion ships retreating to safer waters, a remarkable transformation had occurred. The insult that had launched the greatest war in history now seemed impossibly distant, like a story from another lifetime. The Battle of Westcroft marked a turning point, but the war with the Golden Dominion continued for another 14 months. Unlike the Commerce War, which had been fought with shifting alliances and unclear objectives, this conflict took on a singular clarity of purpose. The 12 kingdoms, now fighting as one, pushed the invaders back to the coast in a series of coordinated campaigns. Dominion forces retreated to their remaining coastal strongholds, where they prepared for a prolonged occupation. Arch-Sovereign Deimos, refusing to accept defeat, ordered his engineers to construct permanent fortifications. "We will remain until these lands submit," he declared to his commanders. The Dominion has never withdrawn from claimed territory. The Allied forces faced a difficult decision. A direct assault on these fortifications would cost thousands of lives. A siege could take years, and always there was the risk that the fragile alliance would fracture once the immediate danger subsided. Elena Solarin proposed an unexpected strategy during the War Council. "We have been thinking of this conflict in traditional terms," she said, spreading maps across the table. "But our true strength has always been commerce, not conquest." Her plan was bold. Instead of attacking the Dominion forces directly, they would establish a complete economic blockade. Every route by land or sea would be cut off. No supplies would enter. No communication would reach the Dominion homeland. Meanwhile, the 12 kingdoms would send emissaries to other lands threatened by Dominion expansion, creating a network of resistance far beyond their own shores. Sebastian Valerian immediately recognized the elegance of this approach. "They came expecting to find divided kingdoms ready for harvest," he said. "Instead, they will become the isolated ones, surrounded by unified opposition." The strategy required immense patience. For 6 months, Dominion soldiers remained barricaded in their coastal fortresses, while Allied forces maintained their blockade. Attempts to break through were met with overwhelming response. Supply ships from the Dominion homeland were intercepted or turned back. Inside the fortifications, conditions deteriorated rapidly. Supplies dwindled. Disease spread through cramped quarters. Morale collapsed as soldiers realized no reinforcements were coming. Junior officers began questioning Deimos' refusal to consider withdrawal. The end came not with a climactic battle, but with a delegation of Dominion commanders approaching under a flag of truce. They had imprisoned Deimos after he ordered a suicide attack against Allied positions, and now sought terms for withdrawal. After 2 days of negotiation, an agreement was reached. The Dominion would abandon all captured territory and recognize the sovereignty of the 12 kingdoms. As enemy ships disappeared over the horizon, a profound silence fell over the gathered forces. For nearly 7 years, the people of the 12 kingdoms had known nothing but war, first against each other, then against the Dominion. An entire generation had come of age knowing only conflict. Now they faced the unfamiliar prospect of peace. In the great square of Meropolis, where the fateful insult had been exchanged years before, Sebastian Valerian and Elena Solarin addressed the assembled representatives of all 12 kingdoms. Behind them stood the newly formed Council of Reconciliation, tasked with rebuilding what had been destroyed. "We have survived by remembering what unites us is stronger than what divides us," Elena said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. This truth was always present, though it took our near destruction to reveal it. Sebastian stepped forward. "The greatest tragedy would be to forget the lesson purchased at such cost. We must build something new from these ashes, not a return to what was, but a path to what might be." As the crowd dispersed, a stonemason began work on a monument that would stand in the center of the square. It depicted not military glory or triumph, but 2 hands clasped in alliance. The inscription read simply, "From a single word came war, from countless sacrifices came unity." The reconstruction had begun. The decade following the Dominion's retreat became known as the Great Restoration. Physical rebuilding was the most visible aspect. Cities rose from rubble, fields were cleared of battle debris, and waterways were reopened for trade. But the more profound reconstruction occurred in how the 12 kingdoms related to one another. The Council of Reconciliation, initially established as a temporary measure, evolved into a permanent governing body with representatives from each kingdom. Meeting in a purpose-built circular chamber in Meropolis, they worked to resolve disputes that once would have led to armed conflict. When tensions flared, as they inevitably did, council members would often point to the eastern horizon, a simple reminder of what disunity had nearly cost them. Sebastian Valerian and Alina Solaran, once bitter enemies, became the most vocal advocates for this new system. Their unlikely partnership gave credibility to the reconciliation process, particularly among those who had suffered most during the Commerce War. If these two could set aside their grievances for the common good, others reasoned, perhaps ancient rivalries need not be eternal. Peace is not the absence of conflict, Alina often said during council debates. It is the presence of better methods for resolving it. The most ambitious project of the Restoration era was the establishment of the Concordat Archives. Housed in a neutral territory between kingdoms, this institution collected first-hand accounts of both wars from all perspectives: soldiers and civilians, nobles and commoners, victors and defeated. The goal was not to establish a single authoritative history, but to preserve the complexity of experience for future generations. Memory is our most powerful defense against repetition, Sebastian declared at the Archive's dedication ceremony. We must remember not just what happened, but how easily it began and how difficult it was to end. Not all rebuilding efforts succeeded. Some villages, having lost too many of their young people, simply faded away. Several noble houses that had committed their entire fortunes to the war effort collapsed into bankruptcy. The emotional wounds proved even more difficult to heal than physical ones. Parents who had lost children to battles now considered pointless. Soldiers who had committed acts they could not reconcile with peacetime morality. Civilians whose homes and livelihoods had been destroyed for strategic advantages that ultimately meant nothing. For these deeper injuries, the council established hearths of remembrance, simple stone structures where people could gather to share their grief without judgment. These became unexpected centers of healing as former enemies found common ground in their shared trauma. The marketplace where the fateful insult had been exchanged was transformed into the forum of second chances. By tradition, it became a place where conflicts were brought to be resolved through mediation rather than escalation. In its center stood a fountain with water flowing over smooth stones, symbolizing how time and patience could wear away the sharpest grievances. 7 years after the Dominion's defeat, messengers arrived with news that the once mighty empire had collapsed into civil war. Several provinces had declared independence, inspired by the example of the 12 kingdoms' successful resistance. The council debated whether to intervene, ultimately deciding to send humanitarian aid, but not military forces. We defend ourselves absolutely, Alina argued during the decisive session. We assist others generously, but we conquer no one, ever. On the 10th anniversary of the peace, Sebastian Valerian and Alina Solaran made a pilgrimage to significant sites from both wars, accompanied by chroniclers who recorded their reflections. At the battlefield of Eastwatch, now returned to a peaceful harbor, Sebastian paused before a memorial listing those lost in the first major engagement. The tragedy, he said quietly, is not that people will forget this war happened. It's that they will forget how unnecessarily it began. Alina nodded. And how easily it could happen again. 20 years after the insult that sparked the Commerce War, a new generation had come of age knowing peace as the natural state of affairs. Children who had hidden in cellars during bombardments now managed thriving businesses. Young scholars studied at the newly established University of Unified Knowledge, where faculty from all 12 kingdoms shared their expertise. The economic integration that began as a wartime necessity had evolved into a complex network of trade relationships. Goods flowed freely across borders that once had been heavily fortified. The merchant guilds, including both Valyrian and Solaran interests, had merged into larger collectives focused on mutual prosperity rather than competition. Sebastian Valyrian, his hair now streaked with gray, had stepped back from daily governance to focus on diplomatic relations with distant lands. His travels had taken him even to former Dominion territories, where he helped establish trading partnerships with newly independent states. The young man who had once escalated a family dispute into war had become one of the most respected voices for measured diplomacy. Alina Solaran remained more directly involved in council matters, often mediating the most difficult disputes between kingdoms. Her reputation for fairness had grown to near legendary status, with parties in conflict specifically requesting her intervention. The sharp-tongued merchant who had matched insult for insult in that fateful marketplace exchange had transformed into a patient listener who could find common ground between the most entrenched opponents. On a warm summer evening, as preparations were underway for the Festival of Unity that commemorated the alliance against the Dominion, Sebastian returned from his latest diplomatic mission to find Alina waiting at the harbor. "The Western Islands have signed the trade agreement," he announced as he disembarked. "That makes 17 lands now participating in the extended Concordat." Alina nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "While you were away, we received disturbing reports from our eastern observers. There's a new power rising from the remnants of the Dominion, calling themselves the Crimson Assembly. They've united 3 former provinces under military rule." Sebastian's smile faded. "Are they expansionist?" "Their rhetoric suggests so. They speak of reclaiming lost glory and punishing those who brought the Dominion low. The council meets tomorrow to discuss our response." As they walked through the city streets, now illuminated by lanterns for the upcoming festival, both remained silent, contemplating this potential threat. Around them, citizens went about their evening activities, unaware of the concerning news. Children played games that once had mimicked warfare, but now celebrated cooperation. Street performers enacted stylized versions of the alliance that had saved the kingdoms. "We've built something remarkable," Sebastian said finally. "Something worth protecting." Alina nodded. "But protection cannot mean preemptive aggression. That path leads back to where we started. We'll find the balance," he assured her. "We've learned too much to repeat the past." The next day, the council chamber filled beyond capacity as representatives gathered to hear the intelligence reports. Maps were unfolded showing the Crimson Assembly's territory and suspected military capabilities. Opinions varied widely on the appropriate response, from immediate military preparation to diplomatic outreach. When the initial discussion concluded, all eyes turned to Sebastian and Alina, whose voices carried particular weight in matters of war and peace. They exchanged a glance, 20 years of shared history passing between them in a silent moment of understanding. Sebastian rose first. "Before we decide anything, I believe there's a story we should remember, one that begins with 2 proud people in a marketplace, neither willing to step back from an insult." Alina continued where he left off, "and ends with the understanding that our greatest strength lies not in our capacity for conflict, but in our capacity for reconciliation." As the council settled in to revisit this foundational narrative, the lesson was clear. The path forward would be determined not by fear of what might happen, but by wisdom gained from what had already occurred.